friends, I have a question for you. Do you know what is alive but has no eyes, no ears, no nose, and it tastes things with its skin? Did you guess? It's a worm. Worms are really interesting and amazing creatures, and I think that we should take some time right now to take a closer look at these fun little critters. Here's some really fun facts about worms. Worms are really hungry little creatures, and they eat as much as they weigh in food every single day. Can you imagine if we were that way? You had to eat 85 pounds of food a day? You couldn't do it, but a worm can. Worms love to eat dead plants, fallen leaves, fungus like mushrooms, bacteria. They even eat dead animals. That's why worms are part of a group of critters called decomposers. They help to clean up our planet by decomposing things that have died. Sometimes you might be walking along and see a little mound of dirt. That's called a worm casting. It's really worm poop. Worms are really wonderful for our soil. They help to loosen and mix up the soil. They also help to get oxygen in the soil. And because they burrow down and make channels in the soil, it helps water to drain so that we don't have so much flooding. The rain has a place to go. It goes down into the worm tunnels. Worms are also really great because they give other animals a food source. Things like moles, hedgehogs, frogs, and birds have to have things like worms to eat or they won't survive. So, worms do not have eyes, but they can detect light through their skin. Worms will move away from bright light so that their skin does not dry out. It has to stay moist if they're going to live. All living animals need oxygen. Worms cannot breathe through their mouth, and they cannot breathe through their nose because they don't have either of those things. They don't even have lungs. Instead, worms have a thin, permeable skin. Permeable means that things can pass through it. So, oxygen passes in through the skin, and that's how the worm breathes. Worms are kind of amazing because they don't have a multi-chambered heart like we do. Instead, they have 5 single-chambered aortic arches, which act like a heart. These little arches pump blood through the body of the worm, and the 5 hearts are way up close to the head of a worm. The average lifespan of a worm is only about 2 years, but sometimes they have been known to live as long as 8 years. Now you see these little segments on the worm? Each segment has tiny hairs on it. These hairs are really strong and they help to move the worm through the soil. It can grip and pull with the hairs on its segments. You can tell if it's an adult worm because they have a ring around them, like this one here, and it's called the clitella. Some people call this a saddle on a worm. This saddle is what the eggs are held in. As the worm gets closer to laying its eggs, the saddle moves up closer to the head, and when it finally passes off of the head, it turns into a cocoon. The cocoon has about 2 to 4 baby worms inside of it that are actually in little eggs. The eggs are yellowish and gold colored, and they're kind of the shape of a lemon. And the cocoons are really little. They're very hard to find out in the wild. So each cocoon takes about 11 weeks to mature before it hatches out the baby worms. Cocoons can even be dormant, which means asleep, for years until it is warm enough and wet enough for the babies to hatch out. Did you know that there are about 6,000 different kinds of earthworms? Worms are on every single continent except for Antarctica. It is too cold there. Here's another fun fact. Worms are older than dinosaurs. The first dinosaurs appeared about 231 million years ago, but earthworms have been around for 600 million years. Here's our last fun fact. Worms are made up of 90% water. Humans are 75% water. So you can imagine why it's so important for a worm to stay moist. Worms have different body parts. Here's a diagram of a worm. You can see at the front, there's his mouth, And then that's kind of the head region, but there are no eyes or ears. There's no nose there. Then you can see the clitellum, which is also called the saddle. All along the worm, there are little tiny segments that help it to expand and move through the dirt. And then you can also find the tail end. You'll know the head end of a worm because the saddle is much closer to the head than it is to the tail. So you can just take a real close look at your worm, and if you find the saddle, the end it's closest to is typically the head end of the worm. Here are 3 different types of worms that I found to show you today. This huge worm right here is called a Canadian nightcrawler. People love to use these for fishing because they're so huge. You can see he's using his head to kind of sniff around. Now, I did tell you that the worm tastes with his skin. So everywhere that his skin touches, he is tasting. Wouldn't it be terrible if we could taste with our skin? With our feet, we could taste our socks. With our hands, we could taste our gloves or anything that we were touching. I'm glad that we're not like worms. Now, this worm has a saddle on him, and it's hard to see. They're a little bit different on the night crawlers, but it's right about here, which tells me that this is the head of the worm. And his 5 hearts are located up here. This is his mouth right here where he's really moving around. You can see it going. And he is tasting around and seeing if there's anything to eat. Now, these night crawlers eat a lot of things that are decomposing and breaking down and that have already died, like dead leaves and things like that. You can see he's kind of touching a piece of a dead leaf right there. This second worm that I found for you, this is just a regular old earthworm. He's kind of a tiny little guy. I found him in my garden this morning. It was raining a little bit out, and I just stuck the shovel in and did one dig, and boop, out popped a bunch of worms. Now this one, I can tell, is just a teenager worm because he does not have a saddle on him. I'm gently brushing off the dirt. You could run them under not super cold water, just kind of lukewarm water, to get off the dirt if you wanted to see better. But I'm kind of softly brushing off the dirt, and I do not see a saddle on this worm, which means that he's just a young guy. He's just a teenager, or maybe he's in grade school. Perhaps he's a 2nd grader. You don't know. Now, so that makes it really hard for me to tell which is the head end and which is the tail end. Although when I'm touching him, do you notice how this front end is moving more than the back end? That kind of is giving me a clue that that's probably the head of the worm. It likes to be the first thing to move to get out of the way of danger. I wonder what will happen when these worms meet up. Looks like nothing much. Now, this last worm right here, this teeny tiny guy, he is probably the most important worm on my wet paper towel. You might be wondering why I have a wet paper towel down. Worms have to have moisture or they will die. So if you're going to dig up a worm, look at a worm, play with a worm, you're going to need to have something wet around for them to string out on and roll around on, because if they dry up, they will quickly die. Now this little guy right here, this is a very important worm. He is called a red wiggler. And this worm loves to eat dead stuff. And they actually eat dead stuff faster than any of the other worms here on this paper towel. This red wiggler eats more than its weight every single day in garbage. And they are used to decompose food. Actually, this little guy is used in my house. I have a worm farm, and I feed them all the scraps of the things that we don't eat in a day, like pieces of carrot peel that I took off the carrots before I cooked them. I put them in the worm bin, and I have a bunch of these little red wigglers in there, and they just eat it all up. They love it. And then I take their castings or their poo after they're done with it, and I put it in my garden, and boy, do my plants grow big. They love worm castings. Now you can see on this little guy, I wonder if I can get him up close to the camera. You can see on this little guy, he's got a saddle right here, which means that that's his head and that this is where the eggs will come out. So eventually this will fill with eggs, and it'll slowly roll up his body and pop off of his head, and then it'll lay in the dirt, and a few weeks later the baby worms will hatch. They're super tiny when they first hatch. It's really hard to see them. If you are going to catch a worm like I did this little earthworm this morning when I dug him up, you're going to want to keep him in a jar with a lid that has holes in it, like this. I just had my husband drill some holes in the top of a jar lid, and then I put the dirt in here. And when I put the worm in, I screwed the lid on so that the worm could not escape. But he does need air to breathe. Remember, they breathe through their skin. So I want the air holes to make sure that he has something to breathe. Now, if you're going to keep your worm for the day in the house, I don't recommend you keeping them longer than that because they don't like to live in jars. They like to live out in the huge, wide world. Then you're gonna need to have some dirt in there for your worm. You can see I got another little guy hanging out in here. Oh, he doesn't like that I'm bothering him. And you're gonna want the dirt to just be a little bit wet. Worms will drown if there's too much water. So you just want a little bit of water in there, just enough so that the dirt is moist so that the worm doesn't dry out. And then you can keep your worm in the jar in your house if you want for about a whole day. At the end of the day, you should take the worm out and release him because they typically don't live for very long in this small of a space and without the right amount of food. Now you can see my little wormies over here are having some fun, traveling all around, getting excited about the world. So, here's my challenge for you. Try to find an area of dirt somewhere around your house. Ask your parents if it's okay for you to dig in that dirt. And then see if you can find a worm. If you find a worm, take a picture of it. Post it to us on Seesaw. Thanks for listening. I hope you learned something today. Bye-bye.